Okay. All right. Thanks all for coming today to hear me present some of the research I've been doing on group sex and sexual risk behavior using data from the Amsterdam gay men's cohort study. So just a quick background, probably not needed for this audience, but men who have sex with men are at an elevated risk of acquiring HIV and other sexually transmitted infection. And I think group sex is something that's assumed to be inherently risky with regards to acquiring HIV and other STIs. You have multiple partners, multiple sexual acts being performed in a short period of time. So that's obviously a context in which transmission could occur. There is some literature on group sex. It's not extensive, but there are studies out there. And just to summarize it, I think group sex is bound to be associated with drug use, elevated levels of sexual risk behavior, reported levels of condomless anal intercourse during group sex range from 25 to 55%, and that's among multiple studies. And then a more recent study found that MSM were more likely to use condoms during group sex than dyadic sex, but they found that MSM who participated in both dyadic and group sex were more likely to have gonorrhea. And that last finding in particular sort of got us thinking, could group sex maybe be more nuanced than is commonly assumed? Certainly, characteristics of group sex can vary. And we wondered, are there discernible patterns or types of group sex behavior that we could identify? And if so, do those different types of group sex vary in terms of risk of transmission for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections? And so the objectives of the present study was to identify discernible types of group sex based on the characteristics I have listed here. And then if we are able to identify discernible types of group sex, we wanted to assess whether those types have differing levels of sexual behavior related to HIV and STI transmission. And so the data that we used for this project, I said, is the Amsterdam gay men's cohort study. It's an open, ongoing, prospective cohort study. Men are recruited in the study through convenience sampling, through STI clinics and other venues that gay men frequent, as well as referrals from men who are already participating. And the eligibility is that you live in or around Amsterdam and have had one or more male sexual partners in the past 6 months. Every 6 months, participants are invited to come in and complete a self-administered questionnaire regarding their sexual behavior in the preceding 6 months. And from 2015 to 2018, so for 6 waves, they were asked detailed questions about group sex. And so for that, group sex was defined as a sexual encounter that involved more than one other sexual partner. It could be steady or casual. And for this project, we used all HIV negative men who reported a group sex event. So it was 35% of the eligible visits had a reported group sex event. So I thought it was more common than I expected. And so then the comparisons that I'll be talking about today are all within men who reported participating in a group sex event. So we're not comparing group sex to dyadic sex, we're talking about within group sex. So the group sex questions, I've listed them here in detail, but they were about the most typical characteristics about the group sex events that men participated in. So it was about, and they were asked about the size of the group, familiarity with the partners, the location, whether it was public or private, whether it had been planned previously, and respondents were also asked about their drug use during group sex, and that does not include alcohol use for this analysis, and is focused on recreational use, not medically indicated use. And then we ran a latent class analysis to identify the group sex types, And just a quick introduction to latent class analysis. Basically, we used a generalized structural equation modeling, and that was used to identify underlying unobserved latent subgroups using the set of observed categorical indicators that I described previously. So it's a data-driven approach, right? It's based on correlation among those measures. And practically what we're looking for is distinct patterns in how those group sex characteristics cluster together. And then if there are differing patterns of those characteristics, we could say that those represent different types of group sex. So it's a multi-step process. The first step is to identify how many different types of group sex there are from the data. You do that based on model fit, a test statistic that it generates. And you're basically looking at how well does the data fit the model, and is there a better fit with more or less classes. And then you generate conditional probability of being in a particular class based on the distribution of those characteristics. And then there's a latent class distribution. So how common is each type of group sex that emerges, and is it distributed in a way that it can be analyzed, right? Is it all one group and it looks fairly homogeneous, or is it too widely dispersed that it's not meaningful, or do you get a nice distribution of group sex types with meaningful characteristics within them? And then once the second step is, once these classes have been identified, is you have to interpret and label the classes. So all the model does is provide statistical information about the relationship, about the indicators, but it's up to the researchers to interpret and give meaning to those classes, right? So it's based on our knowledge of the literature on group sex, the probabilities of being in those groups, and also what characteristics stand out for each of these types. And then the second stage of our analyses was our interest in sexual behavior outcomes, right? And so for those, men were asked about a number of sexual practices during group sex. The first one was barrierless shared receptive fingering. And the second was barriered shared receptive fisting and or the use of sex toys. And the third was condomless anal intercourse, and it could be receptive or insertive. And I think these sexual behaviors were asked about are selected because they were thought of having risk of HIV or STI transmission to the respondent, right? So we're interested in group sex types, but how that translates to sexual behavior with risk to the respondent. And the questions, specifically were you fingered by another partner during that most typical group sex encounter? Was a glove always used during that fingering? Was the same finger or glove that was used with you previously used on another partner? And that was for both fingering, fisting, sex toys, and then condomless anal intercourse was asked about separately. And then for the statistical analyses, we just used binomial logistic regression to test the associations between the group sex type and each outcome separately. The only thing kind of unique about that is we created group sex type specific estimates and compared them to the sample mean versus choosing an arbitrary reference group. And then we also used GEE to account for the fact that there were multiple observations among individuals, right? Because they participated in 6 waves, and as you see, many men reported more than one event during the study period. All right, so now I can get into the results. So there ended up being 390 men who reported one or more group sex event during the study period. The majority of them were Dutch nationals. I don't know a lot about the demographics of Amsterdam, but I've been told it's a fairly homogeneous cohort and fairly representative of the city's population. The median age was 40. There's a fairly high level of education. And then the median number of group sex events was 2.6. That's out of a maximum of 6 total. And there ended up being a total number of 1,015 group sex events that we had available to analyze. And then in terms of how those 1,015 group sex events break down in terms of the group sex characteristics, you can see that more than half, around half were threesomes, but there were larger groups. It seemed fairly evenly distributed between mostly known partners, mostly unknown partners, and then as many known as unknown. About 2/3 of the encounters took place in a private setting versus public, and about 39% were planned versus spontaneous. And there was I thought, a high level of respondent drug use, right? In 68% of encounters, the respondent reported having used drugs other than alcohol during a group sex event.
Justin, can I ask this question? These are the percentages out of those who reported group sex?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, of the 1,015 events.
Events. Okay.
Yeah, these were asked about each of those events, but it was 390 men that contributed to these, right? But everything now is on the sort of event level, right? So then we ran the latent class analysis, and 4 types of group sex emerged as having the best fit for the data. And I, as you can see, have labeled them familiar, intimate, impromptu, and party. My co-authors encouraged me to keep the names pithy, so it'll be up to you if you think these are pithy enough, and we can talk about, I'll talk about them in detail next, but there's still some conversations going around about the best way to name, especially the intimate group. So, but that was something that we had to think about. But you can also see that there was a nice distribution of the different types among the sample, which was promising in terms of the next stage of the analyses. So now I'll talk about these each in more detail. The first group sex type that emerged was familiar. That consisted of mostly known partners in 65% of the cases, and that's actually, it was quite high compared to the other groups. The other groups, it was only 0 to 23%. So it's not as high as some of the other characteristics, but you're making comparisons not only within the categories, but between the different types, right? So this type consists of mostly known partners. 98% of the time it occurred in private places, and 94% of the time it involved respondent drug use. And that's why we named it familiar, right? It's with people in a private places, and then drug use is taking place. The second type we named intimate because it was almost exclusively threesomes, also almost exclusively in private places. And then in this case, drug use was far less frequent. 40% is still high, but relative to the other groups, it's lower, considerably than the other groups. And then the third type that emerged, we named impromptu. That involved mostly unknown partners, and 80% of the time, public places, 3/4 of the time, and it was almost exclusively spontaneous, right? It hadn't been planned beforehand. And then the last group we called party group sex, and that featured larger groups. 82% of the time it was larger groups. I think 18% it was 4 to 5 men, and then 0% of the time it was threesomes. It was mostly unknown partners, 89% of the time. But as opposed to impromptu, this one was planned 78% of the time. And so we felt pretty good coming out of this that we'd identified 4 distinct types of group sex, and they seem to have defining characteristics in terms of how they compared to the other groups and within themselves, high proportions of certain characteristics and low of others. So they seem to make sense to us. And so now we wanted to know, not only are these are there patterns of group sex, but might they matter in terms of what type of sexual behavior is occurring during those events? And so that brings us to the sexual behavior outcomes. So this is the prevalence of each of those behaviors among the entire sample, right? So our first one, the barrier to shared receptive fingering, occurred in 39% of the group sex events. Fisting and sex toys were much less frequent, but because there were low prevalence, and also because we thought they were similarly more intensive practices, we combined those two, and that's why when I spoke about them earlier, it's fisting and or the use of sex toys. And when you combine that, it was 7% of the time, right? Because there was some overlap. And then finally, condomless anal intercourse, which took place in 26% of the encounters, and that was within that range of prevalence that had been reported previously in the literature, but maybe towards the low end. So then we did those binomial logistic regressions with GEE to calculate odds ratios, and we did the analyses where we looked at group sex type and how it was associated with each sexual behavior outcome. So the first one that we did was group sex type and fingering. So if you remember that, the sample prevalence was 39%, but among the familiar group sex type, the prevalence was 53%, right? And based on the logistic regression, there was an elevated odds of having shared barrierless fingering compared to the sample mean, right? And that, the null did not, the confidence interval didn't cross the null, so it was a significant relationship. Next, we looked at group sex type and fisting and or use of sex toys. Again, this was much less frequent. The sample prevalence was only 7%, but again, among the familiar group sex type, we saw an elevated prevalence, right, of 17%, which translated to another statistically significant association with an odds ratio of 2.3. But then among the intimate group, the prevalence was much lower, and it ended up, seeming to have a protective effect against this particular risk behavior. And this, was also encouraging because it got us thinking about, well, what might be different? What might be the different characteristics about these two types of relatively similar group sex events that might matter in terms of the behavior that men engage in during these encounters. And you might remember that familiar group sex had the highest proportion of known partners, where there's maybe an increased comfort level or, knowledge of particular preferences that they could prepare for. And there was also higher levels of drug use, right? Versus intimate group sex, which was also in private places, but really had much lower levels of drug use, which could have, translated to, less intensive behaviors taking place. So just something to consider. And then lastly, we looked at group sex type and condomless anal intercourse. And again, the sample prevalence for this was 26%, but among the impromptu group sex type, the prevalence was only 21%, which again was a statistically significant association in a protective sense. And then it was actually elevated in the party group sex type with a prevalence of 36%. And again, that ended up being a significant association, which, I think is cause for maybe concern if in cases with larger groups and more unknown partners, more potentially risky behavior is taking place. So I think in summary, our main finding is that we were able to identify 4 types of group sex behavior with distinct characteristics. We weren't sure of that coming into the analyses, and they did seem to emerge in a way that was logical and coherent, at least to us as the authors. And the types of group sex were differentially associated with sexual behaviors that were related to HIV and STI transmission. So that, that seems to matter in terms of, how you might conceptualize risk and think about how to address it. There are certain limitations, even though it's a cohort study, our analyses were cross-sectional, right? And one, I think, question that remains is, does men's group sex behavior change over time, right? We did account for multiple observations within individuals, but, we didn't look at, those patterns over time or how things might change depending on relationship status or other characteristics. But I think that would be an interesting direction for future research. Also, PrEP was not considered in this study. Having discussed with the co-authors, they feel like up until 2017, PrEP uptake was very low in Amsterdam. So, if it did play a role in people's, sexual behaviors, then it likely wouldn't have been until the later stages of when the data was collected. But it's certainly a limitations. And then there were other behaviors that weren't asked about, particularly oral sex or masturbatory sex during the group sex encounters that could also relate to HIV or STI transmission. Probably more likely STI transmission, but it's certainly something we would have liked to know about. And so in conclusion, these findings suggest that, group sex encounters, the men engaged in them have distinct patterns, and that, we think it's a call for further research is needed to explore these different group types and maybe better understand their association with sexual behaviors, right? What might be the more salient characteristics about certain types that could allow for, that would encourage, those behaviors to occur. And also, both quantitatively looking further at the data, but also qualitatively finding more out about these contexts and what else might be present there that influences sexual behavior. And then I think it also, could possibly have implications about HIV and STI prevention. Just for example, in half of the group sex, the party group sex, right, it takes place in both private and public settings, right? So, venue-based, targeting would only reach half of those events, whereas, 78% of them were planned, so targeting when they're planned or the people that plan them could be a potentially more efficient way to get out, increase awareness about HIV transmission and ways to prevent it. And so those are our thoughts for now. It's an ongoing paper, but we're getting close to finishing it up. And I just want to end by acknowledging our funding support and also the contribution of our co-authors. Teo's been involved, and he's unfortunately not here today, but he's been helpful. And all these other people have been helpful and great. Thank you.
So thank you. That was really great and so clear, Justin. And you ended with giving us a few minutes for questions. So that's great.
Yeah.
So I'll let you.
Thank you, Justin, for also finally explaining the analysis. At a time when it doesn't in my brain. Well, now we have to study it. I just wondered, would you consider doing an analysis of alcohol use?
Oh, yeah. I think once you put alcohol in it, it goes to there's just no variability. It's almost all.
Because I can imagine that when you brought this up, that somebody will ask about that.
Right.
It's so common, so I would feel.
Yeah. That's why we didn't include alcohol use, is because it got so high that there wasn't enough variability. But, it could be played with more only alcohol use or.
Or if you have, something that it's binge level. So if you know that a man is drinking 5 or more on an occasion.
Right. Yeah, we don't know about the Yeah, we don't know amount at the event, but we do know we could identify binge drinkers and do like a sensitivity analysis. Yeah, but that would be interesting to look at. I agree. And I've been done alcohol research, so it'd be relevant to what I work on.
Was the type of drug besides alcohol looked at?
No, that's what I think is one of the next steps, is kind of looking within those. I don't know why that. Within the group sex types and see if is it certain drugs. There's not so much data, but there's 1,000 observations there. So is it certain drugs that matter more, like chemsex drug, or is it like really more important whether it was planned or not, or the venue, I think those types of further analyses are definitely the next steps.
Were they mostly circumcised?
That I actually don't even know if that's in the data, but it's a big data set, and I just worked with one small section, so it could be explored.
You looked into shared fingering and fisting. Is there any evidence that these behaviors transmit HIV?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I mean, not that I've reviewed either, but I think it's something that actually came up as I practice it, like why were these the behaviors that were asked about? And honestly, I kind of just worked with the data that was there, but I think it's something that could come up and should be explored.
Well, it seems, obviously unprotected anal sex is a variable of main importance.
Right.
The other two are at a complete different level.
Right. Yeah, I think they're of interest because of STI transmission, but even that, I don't know how much evidence there's to support that, they're a big concern.
Just on that topic, I know we had talked a lot, almost to the point that it seemed like I was making a joke about the lack of oral sex in this study. But the way you explained it,
we don't know if it happened. We just.
I think maybe what they were getting at was the idea that there might be blood from tearing on like a sex toy or on a hand, and that the blood is being transmitted. So I think that would directly facilitate HIV transmission, but not related to other STIs.
Right, yeah.
But I don't think that there's any evidence. It's harder with these other sort of sex acts that are not intercourse to even demonstrate transmission ability, because so often they're part of foreplay or part of a sexual encounter that involves intercourse. So it's very hard, and people who do them very rarely don't do intercourse, that don't participate in intercourse. So you have to find people who had a transmission event without, with no history of intercourse and a definite history of these acts. And I think it's just
right
studyable in a sense.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that would be.
It makes sense to me that if you're thinking of like passing blood from one person's, from one anus to another, that would be high risk of transmission because of the tissue there.
Right.
And Hep C.
Yeah.
And Hep C. Yeah, absolutely.
Susie?
Thanks, Justin. So your patterns are quite clear for the types of group sex.
Right.
But in terms of which ones are riskier, maybe I missed this, didn't totally process this, but would you say that there are patterns there in terms of which groups are the risk? Which types of group sex are the riskiest?
Oh, yeah, it seemed like, the familiar, in terms of, being associated both with fingering and fisting and our use of sex toys, that was consistently had a higher prevalence, and that's why I think it would be interesting to look further. Is it because these are known partners, or is it because they're often involving drug use? Like, why are these particular behaviors, more common during those types of group sex? And then, I think the party group sex type having the elevated levels of condomless anal intercourse, even though, it didn't matter in terms of those other characteristics, that being, maybe an outcome of more immediate concern is, I think, would make it, worth focusing on. But it was the least actually common type of group sex, and I think maybe in a lot of people's minds it's maybe the most common, but or at least the one, the most concern. But so it might be the riskiest, but it's happening the least, Yeah.
One more question from Brian, and then
I'm following up on what Susan said, and I think I'll demonstrate that I don't understand making class analysis with this question. So you were looking at events, right?
Yes.
Is it possible to have a sense of what the likelihood is that a particular person falls within one of these classes? And are there other demographic characteristics of these particular classes of people, like is familiar older or younger, or some other demographic characteristic that would be helpful in determining, who falls within these classes?
Yeah. So like obviously each of these encounters are attached to an individual, right? So you could look at the distribution of the individuals that participate in party sex is, demographic characteristics. It would just be of the respondent, obviously. But they would probably, they could appear multiple times, right? And I did look at it quickly, for this presentation, wondering like how often did people change, right?
Yeah.
And it was more common than I expected. So like there were 390 men that reported group sex, but only like 130 some only did one, right? So they can't change. But of the 260 that reported multiple, half of them fell between types, right? So it they could have done multiple encounters during the 6 months, and we're just asking them about the most typical, right? But that is something you could look into further, characteristics of the respondent, and then also
How that might change over time also.
yeah, how that could, yeah. I mean, I imagine it did change over time because people changed, and I don't know, like, did they go back and forth? But that's something that could be explored, and it could be, is it things about the individual that matters, or is it the context that matters more than those individual characteristics? So
it seems important in terms of like the implication of how you reach people, right? If they fall in multiple classes, then you can reach them in one spot, rather than trying to go to two different spots. Like if they're eventually they're not all gonna end up in party because it's a lower number, but some other.
So I'm gonna jump in just so we can get give Rebecca some time. But Justin, thank you so much. Good luck fitting this.
To rearrange the furniture. Hello, everybody. I'm Alex Carvalho-Diegues, just in case some of you don't know me. And it's a pleasure for me, really, to introduce Rebecca Giguere. Most of you know her. She has been working with us for 11 years. But maybe you don't know that she holds a master's in public health from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She graduated in 2007. Initially, she worked as coordinator for an RCT on youth access to emergency contraception. But only 1 year after her graduation, she came to work at the Kennedy Center, and we have enjoyed tremendously having her with us. Not only got interested in executing projects or studies, different parts of the studies, but also in publishing. She was very interested in all qualitative data, particularly. and dug into it and was able to find very interesting topics that merit publication in scientific journals. So she has 6 articles that she published as first author, and 39 additional articles in which she is co-author. So in 11 years, she has been published, she has participated in publications or published as first author at an average of 4 articles per year. So I think that this is really something wonderful, and also for all of you who are new investigators, I think that it makes you think about the value of good team members. I mean, I have been extraordinarily happy to have an incredible team working with me, and for all of you, it's important to think what the importance of building a team that can support you, that can contribute to your career development as principal investigator, because they can be crucial for that success. So without further ado, I introduce you to Giguere.
Thanks, Alex. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about what has been a major focus of my work here over the past 11 years, which is rectal microbicide research. And our team has focused on the behavioral aspect of clinical trials of rectal microbicides, mainly acceptability and adherence. And our role has evolved a lot over the past 10 or 11 years. So I'm going to tell you, instead of focusing on one study, the story of how the behavioral research in the context of rectal microbicides has evolved. So for those of you who aren't familiar with rectal microbicides, they're products that are in development right now to prevent HIV during anal sex, particularly receptive anal sex. They work similarly to a similar mechanism to oral PrEP. They contain antiretroviral medications. The difference is that they're locally protective instead of systemic protection, and meant to be used at the time of sex. In terms of who's developing them, we've worked for the past probably more than 11 years with the Microbicide Trials Network, which is a NIAID-funded clinical trials network whose goal is to evaluate promising vaginal and rectal microbicide candidates and move them forward towards licensure. So why are we studying rectal microbicides? Well, as everybody here already knows, HIV disproportionately affects populations such as men who have sex with men and transgender women who are at much higher risk of HIV transmission. And that's principally because of they engage in anal sex, and receptive anal sex is much more risky in terms of HIV transmission compared to vaginal sex because the rectal lining is much thinner. And even though we already have condoms and we have oral PrEP, we're trying to develop rectal microbicides because just as in the world of contraception, over the years we've developed many, many, many options, and this has really helped to bring down unplanned pregnancy rates. We're hoping that having another option for HIV prevention during anal sex will help to bring down the rates of HIV. So rectal microbicides are designed to be what we call behaviorally congruent, which means that they can be easily incorporated into people's sex lives, into their regular behaviors without having to make too many modifications. And so, as you can see here, over almost 20 years ago, Dr. Carvalho-Diegues and team published on the frequent use of lubricants among men who have sex with men and the potential for that as a rectal microbicide delivery vehicle. And so one of the first rectal microbicides that was developed was in a gel form to try to mimic a lubricant. And clinical trials of rectal microbicides have frequently been early phase safety studies where they have a product already ready to put to the test, and they want to incorporate behavioral research to find out if people like the product and if they'll use it. And so those are often secondary objectives in these studies. We've operationalized acceptability over the years as liking the product, likelihood of using the product, and ease of product use. And then we also measure adherence, which is use of the product as directed by the protocol. We've used a lot of mixed methods data collection for our behavioral data collection, including quantitative assessments, which are most frequently web-based CASIs, in-depth interviews. Because the clinical sites are all over the country and the world, we're usually doing the interviews either by phone or sometimes incorporating a webcam to be able to see each other. Product use diaries, which started out on paper and then evolved to by phone, using interactive voice response system, and now lately we've been using SMS text messaging for product use diaries. We've had participants bring in used applicators that can be counted by the pharmacies to check for adherence, and audio recording of adherence counseling sessions most recently. So the first tenofovir rectal gel study was called MTN-006 RMP02, and our titles have gotten better over the years. This was a phase 1 study of a vaginal formulation of the tenofovir gel for rectal use. And it was a small study with men and women who used the gel every day for 7 days. So we also interviewed those 18 people, and here are some of their reactions to the gel. They felt gassy, bloated, barely making it to the bathroom on time, very uncomfortable, diarrhea, cramping, leaking. This prompted us to get, and that along with clinical adverse events, prompted a formulation change, and they reduced the glycerin content of the gel to try to make a rectal formulation that was more suitable. So the second tenofovir rectal gel study was MTN-007, which studied the safety of the reduced glycerin tenofovir gel. And again, because we were collecting safety data, participants used it daily for a week. And we looked at acceptability of both of the gels. So the acceptability was measured on a scale, on a 10-point scale, with 10 being the highest rating. So as you can see from the table, the second gel was moderately better than the first gel in terms of acceptability. So what did we learn from the first 2 rectal gel studies? First, daily use of a gel as required by these safety protocols was too much. As participants said, there's no way I would use this every day. I don't even have sex every day. Leakage was a major concern for women and men, but imagine for a man, like, you know, saying he felt like he needed to wear a diaper or a women's pad because he felt something leaking out of him all day. So it was too messy. Also, there were a lot of critiques of the applicator, thinking that the applicator could be improved. I'm going to pass around right now. This is the applicator that was used or in the gel studies, which is the vaginal applicator, but because it had been approved for, you know, the plastic and the lining and everything had been approved for use with the tenofovir gel, this was the one they continued to use in the rectal studies also. So you can imagine using it if you... So that brought us to our third study, which was Project Gel for guys experiencing lube. This was an R01 study led by Alex and Dr. Ian McGowan at the University of Pittsburgh. And it had several different stages. So stage 1B was a behavioral study. So we used a placebo gel and we developed a rectal applicator. The gel was designed to be used with the rectal applicator up to 90 minutes before receptive sex. And we focused on young cisgender men who have sex with men. Stage 2 was a subsample of the people who had participated in the behavioral phase, and they studied the tenofovir gel with the vaginal applicator daily for 7 days to gather more safety data. And then after that, we had some carryover funds, and so we did a feasibility study to recruit a small sample of male and transgender sex workers, mainly in Puerto Rico, and they were given the placebo gel to use with the rectal applicator before sex to see how that would go in their work context. So Project GEL was designed to address two of the challenges that we'd seen in previous studies. One was the applicator, and the other was, having to use the gel every day. So we said, okay, let's give people a gel. Doesn't have to be the gel with tenofovir, but just see, would they use it before sex, and how does that go? But we also wanted to fix the complaints about the applicator. So with a small grant from AMFAR, Alex and team collaborated with PATH, which is a group in Oregon, to conduct some focus groups and identify some of the ways that the applicator could be improved. And they came up with this applicator, which I'm passing around, which is the rectal applicator. So we had, there had been complaints about the tip of the vaginal applicator. So we got tips donated by the Fleet company who develops rectal enemas. So they gave us tips to use on the applicator. We had finger grips to try to make it easier for people to hold on to them and use them and know when they'd push the applicator all the way in. The barrel of the applicator was quite a bit wider than the vaginal applicator because at the time they thought that 50 milliliters of gel was needed to protect the rectum, which was more than for the vagina, so the applicator ended up being a little wider. And so this study, the people who participated in both stage 1B and stage 2 were able to use both applicators in the same study. And surprise, they preferred the vaginal applicator. Portability was an issue for both, particularly, I guess if men are carrying a backpack out, it's fine, but they don't normally necessarily carry a purse like women, so where are you going to put the applicator if you're going out? Even with the Fleet Comfort tips, we had people complaining that the tip was sharp when they inserted it. And then there was the problem of assembly where, as you can see with the rectal applicator, it comes in two pieces and you had to insert the plunger into the barrel. And so people didn't like having to, in that moment, put something together. And this was really important because we also saw in a separate analysis that lower satisfaction with the applicator impacted people's likelihood of using the gel in the future. So in terms of how it went with the gel use before sex, participants were able to use the gel before sex in about 80% of receptive anal intercourse occasions. Factors correlated with using the gel, somewhat predictable. If they liked it, if it made sex better, if their partner had a positive reaction to the gel, and if they, I believe this was if at baseline they reported likelihood of using the gel, they were more likely to use it during the study. Reasons for not using it was either forgetting or not having it on hand, speaking also to the portability of the applicator. If their partners didn't want to use it, if they found the gel messy or they didn't like how it felt. And then I also did the interviews with the sex workers, and so even though it was a very small sample, I felt like it was really important to put something out about their experiences, and all of them were able to use the gel before sex in context of sex work, like before sex with clients. Some of them used it in cars and hotels and all different places. And covert use with that population was very common, where they would just, run to the bathroom beforehand, insert it, be done, not even tell the person. And somebody might have had a little comment and they would just sort of say, yeah, it's really lubed. They also had critiques of the applicator. And we also asked them, this was back in 2013, we wanted to see if they had heard of oral prep and if they would be interested in using it. At that point, among that population, there was very low knowledge of oral prep. They were given a list of potential side effects, and which seemed concerning to them at the time, that this idea of something that was systemically working and that they had to take every day. But they were interested in that as an option for HIV prevention. So the fourth tenofovir rectal gel study was MTN-017, and this was a larger phase 2 trial looking at safety and acceptability. Because oral prep was on the market at that point, we had a crossover study where participants had 3 4-week regimens. They were randomized by order, and they used the gel either daily because we needed to gather more safety data. Gel use before and after receptive anal intercourse was another regimen, and then daily oral prep. And in addition to including transgender women, this study expanded its reach internationally and included sites in Thailand, Peru, and South Africa. So as you can see from the table on the top, adherence to gel use before and after sex was just as high practically as adherence to oral prep. And adherence to gel use 100% of the time before and after sex was also very high. And based on the pie graphs below that show the most and least preferred regimens, the purple is oral prep and the blue is the gel before and after sex. So while more people preferred oral prep as the product they liked the best, there was also, almost 30% of them that said it was the product they liked the least. We also found that participants who, Curtis did this analysis, participants with more sex partners had higher intentions of using a pill daily. Participants with more frequent anal intercourse liked the gel less, but those who had more frequent receptive intercourse liked the gel more, and they were more amenable to using a daily regimen. So these findings, I think, were important because they show that based on people's sexual behavior and sexual preferences, there's going to be different products that work for them. We also recorded all of the adherence counseling sessions, and so I, along with Christine, we listened to the sessions, we coded the sessions, and we looked for what participants were saying about barriers and facilitators to gel use. And so in this study, and this was just with the gel use before and after sex. Again, there were some similar barriers in terms of the application process, physical discomfort after applying the gel. A lot of people had difficulty with having to use the gel both before and afterwards. They would forget afterwards, or they wouldn't remember if they'd used it. The idea of having to anticipate sex, to be able to use the gel beforehand, and then disliking the applicator came up again. As one participant said, over the summer traveling with the applicators, I don't want to deal with customs in Rome asking me what these things are. Facilitators included when people would plan sex and they could use the gel in anticipation, or maybe it wasn't even planned, but they knew they were going out that night, so they said, let me just insert it just in case. Keeping it on hand, finding it easy to use, and incorporating it into regular routines, such as people reporting, well, I regularly douche before sex, so once I'm done with that, I just insert the applicator and it's part of a whole process. So what did we learn from these 4 rectal gel studies? One of the big lessons was that the applicator was a big drawback. We tried to improve upon it. That didn't work. After 4 studies, people were still complaining about having to use this applicator that I think made it less behaviorally congruent. When you use a lube, you don't have an applicator, and so it medicalized something that was supposed to be, convenient and around the time of sex. The simpler the regimen, the better. People didn't like to use it every day. They didn't like to have to use it before and after. And then also, as we found, different lifestyles necessitate an array of choices. People might not always want the same type of product depending on who they're having sex with or what kind of sex they're having. And that people do still want alternatives to oral prep and condoms. As we saw in MTN-017, almost 30% of participants in an international sample said that oral prep was, after having tried it, and with it being the only product that had already been approved for HIV prevention, so they knew that was the only one that was working, it was still their least favorite. So then we thought, okay, maybe this lubricant isn't going anywhere. what else could we do that would be behaviorally congruent, that would play off of a behavior that's already happening? So why not a rectal douche microbicide? And for those of you who don't know what douching is, I'm passing around an enema bottle. You may be more familiar with the word enema. But rectal douching consists of cleansing the rectum, typically in preparation for anal sex. All sorts of devices are used. There's the enema bottle, rubber bulb, things attached to the faucet. Sometimes people even use a water bottle like that. And all sorts of liquids such as water. You can buy commercial enema solutions or a mixture of water with other substances. Alex and team, as you see here, published almost 10 years ago on the potential of a rectal douche as a rectal microbicide delivery vehicle. And at that point, Dr. Craig Hendricks at Johns Hopkins was working on a study to investigate whether changing the salt content in the liquid of a douche could prevent harmful effects. So now we have a dream. I told you the titles were getting better. This is development of a rectal enema as microbicide. It's a U19 program that we're working on with Dr. Hendricks. And the point is to develop a rectal tenofovir douche and something that can be used around the time of sex. It entails 3 clinical studies, and there's really close feedback loops in this study between the behavioral and the clinical, where we completed Dream 01. We were asked about to gather some further information, and so we developed internet-based surveys and recruited participants from Grindr to learn more about their douching behaviors and their interest in a rectal microbicide douche. And those findings informed the design of Dream 03. So there's really close feedback, and it's consisted of several different studies. So far, a douche looks promising. These are the results from the Grindr surveys, and the photo on the left is the image that we used in the ads. So we surveyed, we had over 4,700 participants in the US from all of the different states and territories, and then Grindr changed its ad schema, and so then we got way fewer, but we got still over 500 participants all throughout South America and Mexico. And so most people who reported having receptive sex also reported douching before sex, and many of them also reported douching afterwards. We also asked those who didn't have receptive sex but did have insertive sex if they'd ever asked their partners to douche, and many of them had. And we found, in terms of interest in a rectal microbicide douche, really high interest among those who currently douche, those who currently don't douche, and partners, insertive partners. So it's looking good so far. And reactions to the concept of a rectal microbicide douche, both from people who participated in Dream 01, who tried out the first rectal tenofovir douche, and people in the Grindr survey where it was just hypothetical. You know, I douche anyway, so it's part of my routine. I have anxiety associated with condoms breaking. I don't really want to take a pill every day, so a douche would be better than either of those. And this idea that if there's something that could clean and prevent at the same time, it would be ideal. Then finally, we have a 6th study called Desire. Desire stands for Developing and Evaluating Short-Acting Innovations for Rectal Use. And this is an MTN study. We're looking at acceptability and adherence to a rectal douche, a rectal insert, and a rectal suppository. They're all placebos because this is a behavioral study. It's being led by Dr. Jose Bauermeister, who used to be a fellow here at the center and is currently at the University of Pennsylvania. And it's really been a big evolution for the MTN that they're now, this is the first primarily behavioral rectal microbicide study being led by a behavioral researcher. So we're first trying to find out, before we develop these products, which ones would people prefer. And we're looking at young cisgender men, transgender women around the world. This has also, it's Malawi, South Africa, Peru, Thailand and the US. And they're gonna try each of the products and then give us our feedback about the things they liked and didn't like so we could see which would be the best to move forward with. So in summary, I've shared some lessons that we learned from participants along the way during these 10 years of rectal microbicide research. So we started out with a product that was already developed for vaginal use, and we just wanted to know, did people like it and would they use it, thinking that was simple. But in the process of those trials, we learned that we can't put the cart before the horse, and we really need to listen to what people want first before creating a product for them. And the best way to start is listening to potential users. So finally, I have some photos here of many of the investigators and activists that we've worked with over the past years. It's been a really wonderful team of researchers who have forged ahead in the face of many, many obstacles with the goal of delivering a product that can be easily incorporated at the time of sex with local protection to reduce HIV incidence among men who have sex with men and transgender women. So we have the dream and the desire, and hopefully we can make it happen.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was
Sure.
another really great, clear presentation with some amazing slides. I love the props. So we can open it up for questions and you can direct it.
Okay. Hi.
So we know that there's a big problem with oral PrEP accessibility, especially among people who need it the most. People of color, mostly. Do you think changing the formulation is going to address the access issue? And the second question is, tenofovir, the chemically, it's a nucleotide analog, so it definitely needs some gel. Has anyone looked at Radrock, for example, as topical? Because it wouldn't need lotion or that kind of bead.
I think they did look at that as a gel at one point. Wasn't that the penile tolerability study? But not as a rectal microbicide.
The issue is that tenofovir is already, accepted, it's being commercialized. There's much more. It's a shorter path from where we are with tenofovir to actually being able to implement something that can be used than Maravilla. So I think that although they have looked into the possibility of using different products, we're also involved in another study with the long-acting implantable. And they also have products jumping to the next drug because it's a long process for approval, for the FDA approval. So that's the issue with tenofovir. I think that I just want to mention, it's not, tenofovir doesn't only need to be injected, it can be in a liquid vehicle. And the studies of Craig Hendricks have shown that in the macaque model, it can produce a higher concentration of tenofovir in the rectal mucosa than oral ingestion of the drug. So it's very encouraging. It's very, it looks very good. So I hope you will all join us next month because we have the people from the OER here. I'm sorry, this is a publicity break. One of the things we want to impress on them is that at this point, stopping the research on topical microbicides is a real pity because they have invested millions of dollars in trying to develop them. Sure. But they are focusing only on systemic things like oral drugs or implantables. And many people don't want to have a drug in their body 24 hours, 7 days a week. They want something that they can use in the moment of sex, that is just developing and then disappears. So that's what we are going to hear on mass on next Monday, trying to get this message across, and we hope you will all smile when we talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long journey, and we sort of feel like we might be on the brink of something, and then to have it all like pulled out from under you. But I can say that I was recently at a meeting in Baltimore with Dr. Hendricks and his team, and they were talking about, if this douche is successful, like what are the next steps to getting it out and getting it forward? And I think one of his primary concerns is accessibility. So he doesn't want, to just like have Gilead sweep in and pick it up and then market it, because he wants to make sure that it's able to be accessed by people who need it. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, Susan.
That was really so informative, Rebecca, and great graphics. I think the data that you have on the unacceptability of oral prep over these studies is so valuable, and I wonder if, I don't know if it deserves a paper by itself, it probably does, but certainly I think it would be very valuable, even if you would make a little position paper for us. I think for a lot of us who are working in that screenings.
Okay, something to think about. Thank you.
Have there been any human trials that have demonstrated the efficacy of rectal prep, or is it just sort of extrapolated from the studies that have shown efficacy for vaginal?
Right, yeah, we haven't gotten to phase 3 of these studies, which would be the efficacy trials, so it's still early phase. Hey.
Can you just talk a little bit, so I'm really fascinated with the idea of trying out, having people try out the different products first and seeing which ones they like, but can you talk to me a little bit about how, when you're testing out those products, you don't necessarily know what, for example, the composition of the gel, what it's going to have, what it's going to feel like. So, in theory, I might like something, but then when it comes to actually putting an active drug ingredient in, is that going to change? Would that change what it actually feels like and how it performs? So I'm just kind of curious how close the placebos are to what the real life product is going to be.
So in some of the earlier gel studies, they were placebo controlled. So they had this gel that we called HEC, which was hydroxyethyl cellulose gel. So we had, one arm would use a placebo gel, one arm would use the actual tenofovir gel, and we would compare acceptability ratings and safety ratings and all of that. And I don't think there were major differences between the two groups in terms of acceptability and how the gels felt. And in terms of the douche, we just recently, the DREAMO-1 trial, participants had the tenofovir douche, which they were given in the clinic. But we also wanted to gather some behavioral data on what would happen if you took this home and used it before sex, but they wouldn't let us send them home with the tenofovir douche. And so we just gave them a bottle like the one I passed around, and it had a saline solution that they dumped into it. And then I interviewed them about their experiences with both of the products, and people didn't mention that there were any differences. So people who've used both, I think they try to make it as similar to the formulation that would be used with the drug. So we'll see.
I thought it was so interesting. My impression would be that people who are having anal intercourse frequently, they would want something systemic so that they don't have to think about it, and that that event-driven products are for people who have riskier sex more infrequently. And that's, I think, especially among young women, that's kind of been the message. Talking about seasons of risk and stuff, but it seems like that maybe doesn't apply.
Well, I think,
that's surprising to me.
People who were having more insertive sex would have preferred, I think they liked the gel less. But people who are having more receptive anal, because, and that makes sense. If you're not putting anything there, then why would you want to put a product there? But people who were having more frequent receptive sex liked the gel more.
But I would have thought that they would like just a pill, because if they're having sex frequently, then just having it always in your body versus having to do it on demand. Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that just sort of speaks to your comment about it being behaviorally congruent. People are already doing things to prepare for anal sex. So if you deliver something that just coincides with that behavior, then you don't have to add an additional behavior of taking a pill.
Good point.
And it really speaks to Justin's, I don't remember if he actually showed it today or just to the practice session, but that there's certain behaviors that certain groups of men are engaging in, and this would fit into some of that sort of behavior. And so they might be engaging in condoms anal sex with a certain group, and then this would just fit. So I think that the two presentations really fit well in that way.
So
I just
Yeah,
want
go
to
ahead.
underscore something that I think it's important for us when we go into behavioral research, which is that at the beginning of this process, we were invited to participate in these studies, almost like any other person doing laboratory test. So they said, okay, have a very small questionnaire, hopefully, one or two questions with the libraries get understood. And don't waste too much time with the participants, and we just want that. Send us the questionnaire. And furthermore, the people in charge of the statistical analysis, our friends from Sharp, were saying, well, we already have the questionnaire, so this is what we would like to use. It was a major battle originally, to prove the value added of our work to what they were doing. Things have changed dramatically over these 10 or 11 years, and now actually the networks are starting with behavioral studies like the one for safety, right? Before even saying, okay, what are we going to develop? Is it going to be an insert or a suppositor or whatever? So it has changed dramatically. So we have gained a lot of ground, and now the responsibility is to deliver, to show that what we are studying and finding, makes sense and is not spurious. But it's very tricky.
So if that's the case, why do they want to cut out the networks?
Because
I know it's a merger, they're not saying.
Not all networks, they're trying to merge them and have.
But the MTN is ending. It's
Yeah,
this
for the
next year is the last year.
the issue is that Anthony Fauci has been there for decades. It's very easy to develop a vaccine. But one of the